The notice came on a Tuesday morning in January, slipped under my door like a little yellow snake ready to strike, and when I picked it up, I saw the words that made my blood pressure spike before my first cup of coffee. Violation notice. Failure to maintain safe premises. I stood there in my kitchen in suburban Milwaukee, Wisconsin, holding this piece of paper, reading how the Riverside Meadows Homeowners Association had fined me $500 for having ice on my front walkway. $500 for ice in Wisconsin in January. My name is Frank Keller, and I had lived in this neighborhood for 3 years without major incident. Sure, there were the usual HOA annoyances, like the time they sent me a warning for having my trash cans visible from the street for 20 minutes past the designated pickup time, or when they measured my grass and found it was 3.5 inches instead of the required 3 inches maximum. But this was different. This was insane. I read the violation notice 3 times, each reading making me angrier than the last. According to the document, signed by one Patricia Morrison, HOA president, my front walkway had been inspected at 7 in the morning 2 days prior, on Sunday, and found to have a dangerous accumulation of ice presenting a hazard to pedestrians, postal workers, and other individuals who may need to access the property. The thing was, I had salted my walkway. I had gone out Saturday night after the freezing rain stopped and spread rock salt all across the concrete path leading to my front door. I had been careful about it, knowing how treacherous Wisconsin winters could be. But Sunday morning had brought another surprise freeze, and apparently, a thin layer of ice had formed in the early morning hours before I had even woken up. I grabbed my phone and called the HOA office immediately. The receptionist, a woman named Linda who always sounded exhausted, picked up on the 4th ring. Riverside Meadows HOA, this is Linda speaking. Linda, this is Frank Keller on Ashwood Drive. I just received a violation notice for ice on my walkway, and this is absolutely ridiculous. I salted my walkway. There was freezing rain. It's Wisconsin in January. What exactly am I supposed to do? Stand outside with a blowtorch all night? Linda sighed, and I could hear papers rustling. Mr. Keller, I understand your frustration, but the safety regulations are very clear. All walkways must be kept clear of ice and snow at all times during winter months. At all times. That's impossible. Weather happens. I can't control when it freezes. You can file an appeal, Linda said, her voice taking on the mechanical quality of someone who had said these exact words 1,000 times before. You have 10 business days to submit a written appeal to the board. The next board meeting is 3 weeks from now. And in the meantime, I'm supposed to just pay this $500 fine. The fine is due within 30 days. If you file an appeal and it's granted, you'll receive a refund. I hung up, knowing that arguing with Linda was pointless. She was not the problem. The problem was Patricia Morrison and her band of power-hungry board members who apparently had nothing better to do than drive around the neighborhood at 7 in the morning on a Sunday looking for violations. That afternoon, I sat down at my computer and wrote a detailed appeal. I included photos of my rock salt container, receipts showing I had purchased it, and a printout from the National Weather Service showing the exact timeline of the freezing rain and subsequent temperature drop. I explained that I had taken reasonable precautions, and that expecting homeowners to prevent every possible formation of ice during unpredictable weather conditions was not only unreasonable but impossible. I submitted the appeal the next day, dropping it off personally at the HOA office, which was located in a small building near the neighborhood entrance. Linda accepted it with a sympathetic smile and assured me it would be presented at the next board meeting. 3 weeks felt like an eternity. Every time I left my house, I obsessively checked my walkway, salting it even when there was no precipitation in the forecast. I felt like a prisoner in my own home, constantly worried that Patricia Morrison and her violation clipboard would appear at dawn to document any microscopic imperfection in my property maintenance. The night before the board meeting, I could barely sleep. I had prepared a short statement to read, professional but firm, explaining why the fine was unjust. I had my evidence organized in a folder. I was ready. The board meeting was held in the community center, a bland rectangular building with fluorescent lights that made everyone look slightly ill. I arrived 15 minutes early and found about a dozen other residents already seated in the folding chairs facing a long table where the board members would sit. Patricia Morrison arrived exactly on time, flanked by 4 other board members. Patricia was everything you would imagine when you heard the word HOA president. She was probably in her mid-50s, with severely cut blonde hair that looked like it had been styled with a ruler and level. She wore a navy blue pantsuit and carried herself with the kind of rigid posture that suggested she had never relaxed a single day in her entire life. The other board members were a mix of personalities. There was Roger Chen, the vice president, a retired accountant who looked uncomfortable in his role. Deborah Walsh, the treasurer, a nervous woman in her 60s who kept adjusting her glasses. Martin Hughes, the secretary, a man who barely looked up from his laptop during the entire meeting. And finally, Jennifer Crane, a member-at-large who seemed to be Patricia's loyal supporter in all things. Patricia called the meeting to order with a sharp crack of her gavel that made half the room jump. They went through the standard agenda items, approving minutes from the last meeting, discussing the budget for landscaping, debating the color options for repainting the neighborhood entrance sign. My appeal was item 7 on the agenda, and I watched the clock tick slowly as they droned through each preceding item with excruciating detail. Finally, Patricia cleared her throat and picked up a paper from her stack. Item 7. Appeal of violation fine Frank Keller, 2847 Ashwood Drive. I stood up, my folder clutched in my hand. That's me. Patricia looked at me over her reading glasses with an expression that suggested I was something unpleasant she had discovered on the bottom of her shoe. Mr. Keller, the board has reviewed your written appeal. Would you like to make a brief statement? Yes, thank you. I walked to the front of the room, my heart pounding. As I outlined in my appeal, I took all reasonable precautions to keep my walkway safe. I salted it the evening before the inspection. The ice that formed did so in the early morning hours due to an unexpected temperature drop. I believe that expecting homeowners to prevent every possible ice formation during unpredictable winter weather is not only unreasonable but practically impossible. I've lived in this neighborhood for 3 years and have always maintained my property according to the guidelines. I'm asking the board to overturn this fine. I sat down, and there was a moment of silence. Then Patricia spoke. Mr. Keller, the safety of our neighborhood is the board's primary concern. Just last year, a postal worker slipped on an icy walkway 3 streets over. The homeowner was sued. These regulations exist to protect everyone, including you, from potential liability. I understand that, I said, trying to keep my voice level. But I did salt my walkway. I was responsible. I can't control the weather. Jennifer Crane leaned forward, her expression stern. Perhaps you should have salted it again in the morning. At 7 in the morning on a Sunday. Before I was even awake. That's not reasonable. Patricia held up her hand, silencing me. The board will deliberate and provide our decision by the end of the meeting. Please have a seat, Mr. Keller. I returned to my chair, frustrated. They moved on to the next agenda items, and I sat there steaming, watching Patricia and Jennifer whisper to each other occasionally, watching Roger Chen look increasingly uncomfortable. At the end of the meeting, Patricia announced the board's decisions on the appeals that had been heard. When she got to mine, her voice was crisp and final. The board has voted to uphold the violation fine for Frank Keller. The fine stands at $500, due within 30 days of the original notice. My stomach dropped. You cannot be serious. The vote was 4-1, Mr. Keller. The decision is final unless you wish to pursue legal action against the HOA, which is your right. I stood up, my face hot. This is ridiculous. You're punishing me for weather, for ice that formed while I was asleep. Lower your voice, Mr. Keller, Patricia said coldly. This meeting is adjourned. I walked out of that community center shaking with anger. In the parking lot, Roger Chen caught up with me, looking apologetic. Frank, for what it's worth, I voted against upholding the fine. I thought your appeal made sense. 1 vote out of 5. Thanks, Roger. He winced. Patricia is very strict about the rules. She's been on a crusade about safety violations since she became president last year. Between you and me, I think she goes too far sometimes, but she has Jennifer completely on her side, and Martin usually votes with them. Deborah is too intimidated to disagree. So what am I supposed to do? Pay $500 for ice? Roger shook his head. You could talk to a lawyer. Sometimes when homeowners push back legally, the HOA backs down because the legal fees aren't worth it. I thanked him and drove home, my mind racing. A lawyer. Legal fees. This was spiraling out of control over a patch of morning ice on a Wisconsin sidewalk in January. That weekend, I did something I probably should have done before the board meeting. I drove around the neighborhood, looking at other people's properties, and what I found made my blood boil all over again. Ice. There was ice everywhere. I saw icy patches on walkways on Maple Street, on Birch Avenue, on Cedar Lane. Some properties had icicles hanging from gutters that were clearly hazardous. One house on Willow Court had a walkway that was completely covered in snow that had melted and refrozen into a skating rink. But I had been the one fined. I had been the one singled out. I took photos of everything. Dozens of photos, carefully noting addresses and dates and times. If Patricia Morrison wanted to play hardball about safety violations, I was going to document every single one I could find. On Monday morning, I called 3 different lawyers who specialized in HOA disputes. The first 2 were too expensive, quoting me retainer fees that would cost more than the fine itself. The third, a lawyer named David Sheffield with an office in downtown Milwaukee, agreed to meet with me for a consultation. David's office was in an older building with character, wood paneling and built-in bookshelves crammed with legal volumes. David himself was probably in his early 40s, with graying hair and a friendly demeanor that immediately put me at ease. I told him the whole story, showed him the violation notice, my appeal, and my photos of all the other icy properties in the neighborhood. David listened carefully, occasionally jotting notes on a legal pad. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and steepled his fingers. Okay, Frank, here's the situation. HOAs have broad authority to enforce their rules, but they have to do so consistently and fairly. What you're describing sounds like selective enforcement, which is actually a legal problem for them. If they're fining you for ice but ignoring the same violation on other properties, that's discriminatory enforcement, and you have grounds to fight this. So I have a case, potentially. The stronger argument is the selective enforcement. The photos you took are good evidence. What I'd recommend is sending a formal legal letter to the HOA pointing out the selective enforcement issue and demanding they rescind the fine. Sometimes that's enough to make them back down. And if it's not enough, then we can file a lawsuit. But I'll be honest with you, HOA litigation can get expensive fast. Even if we win, you might spend more on legal fees than the $500 fine, unless we can get them to pay your attorney's fees as part of a settlement. I thought about it. $500 was a lot of money, but it was not really about the money anymore. It was about the principle. It was about Patricia Morrison and her arbitrary enforcement and her power trip. "Let's send the letter," I said. David drafted a strongly worded letter outlining the selective enforcement issue, citing specific examples from my photos and referencing Wisconsin statutes regarding HOA governance. He sent it via certified mail to the HOA board with copies to each individual board member. The response came faster than I expected. 3 days after the letter was delivered, my phone rang. It was Patricia Morrison. "Mr. Keller, I received a letter from an attorney claiming to represent you." "That's correct. David Sheffield is my lawyer." There was a pause, and when Patricia spoke again, her voice was tight with barely controlled anger. "Mr. Keller, I want to be very clear about something. The HOA takes our safety regulations seriously. Your accusations of selective enforcement are baseless. We conduct regular inspections throughout the neighborhood. Then, why are there a dozen other properties with ice on their walkways that haven't been fined? I'm not going to discuss other homeowners with you. That's confidential. What I am going to tell you is that if you continue to pursue this frivolous legal action, the HOA will have no choice but to retain our own legal counsel, and we will seek to recover those costs from you when your lawsuit fails." That sounds like a threat, Patricia. It's a statement of fact. You signed the HOA covenant when you purchased your property. You agreed to abide by the rules. This is not negotiable. We'll see what a judge has to say about that. Patricia's voice went cold. "I'm sure we will. Good day, Mr. Keller." She hung up and I sat there staring at my phone, my heart racing. This was really happening. I was going to war with my HOA over a $500 ice fine. David called me later that afternoon. "I heard from the HOA's attorney. They've hired someone. Guy named Marcus Brennan with a firm called Whitmore and Associates." That was fast. Patricia Morrison doesn't mess around, apparently. Brennan called me this afternoon. He was very aggressive, insisted that the fine is legitimate and that you have no case. I told him we disagree and that we're prepared to file suit if they don't rescind the fine. What happens next? Well, we wait a bit to see if they blink. Sometimes when HOAs actually have to start paying legal fees, they reconsider. But Frank, I have to warn you, Brennan is known for being a bulldog. He represents a lot of HOAs in the area and he doesn't like to lose. This could get ugly. It got ugly fast. 2 weeks later, I received another violation notice. This time, I was being fined $250 for having a wreath on my front door that was not within the approved color scheme specified in the HOA guidelines. The wreath was a simple evergreen wreath with a red bow that I had hung up for Christmas and just had not taken down yet because I liked how it looked. I called David immediately. "They're retaliating. This is clearly retaliation. Keep the notice. Document everything." This actually helps our case. If they're suddenly finding violations after you hired a lawyer, that looks bad for them. The next week, another notice. This time for parking my car in my driveway at an improper angle. Not blocking the sidewalk, not leaking oil, just parked at an angle that Patricia Morrison apparently found offensive. "They're harassing me," I told David. "This is targeted harassment." "I know, and it's all going to be evidence in our lawsuit. Let them keep digging their own grave." In early March, David filed the lawsuit in Milwaukee County Circuit Court. The complaint alleged selective enforcement, retaliatory action, and violations of Wisconsin statutes governing HOA conduct. We were seeking not just the return of the $500 fine, but also damages for the harassment and my attorney's fees. The lawsuit filing made the local news. A reporter from the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel called me for comment, and the story ran with the headline "Homeowner Sues HOA Over Ice Fine, Claims Harassment." The article quoted me explaining the situation and included some of the photos I had taken of other icy properties in the neighborhood. The reaction in the neighborhood was mixed. Some neighbors stopped me when I was checking my mail to express their support, sharing their own horror stories about Patricia Morrison and the board's ridiculous enforcement. Others avoided eye contact and hurried past, clearly not wanting to get involved. One neighbor, a woman named Sarah Turner who lived 2 houses down from me, came over one evening with a bottle of wine and a sympathetic smile. "I just wanted to say I think what you're doing is brave," Sarah said. She was probably in her early 30s, a graphic designer who worked from home. "Patricia Morrison fined me last year for having the wrong shade of beige on my shutters. Beige, Frank. She made me repaint perfectly good shutters because they were supposedly not the approved shade of beige according to the guidelines." "Did you fight it?" "No, I just paid the fine and repainted the shutters. It was $200 plus the cost of the paint and labor." "I wish I had fought it like you're doing." We sat on my porch drinking wine and trading HOA horror stories until it got dark. It was nice to know I was not alone, that other people saw how absurd this whole system had become. The legal process moved slowly, as legal processes always do. There were motions and counter-motions, discovery requests and depositions. David kept me informed every step of the way, but I could see the legal bills mounting up. I was already into this for more than $3,000 in attorney's fees, and we had not even gotten to trial yet. In June, David called me with interesting news. "We're getting close to a trial date. The judge has scheduled us for late August. But here's the thing, Frank. Brennan called me this morning with a settlement offer." "What kind of offer?" "They'll rescind the original $500 fine and dismiss all the subsequent violation notices. But they want you to drop the lawsuit and pay your own legal fees. No admission of wrongdoing on their part." I thought about it. $3,000 in legal fees already, probably another $3,000 or $4,000 to actually go to trial, versus getting the fines dismissed but walking away empty-handed. "No," I said. "I want them to pay my attorney's fees. They're the ones who caused this mess." I told Brennan that's probably what you'd say. He said they won't agree to it. Patricia Morrison is apparently adamant about not setting a precedent of paying homeowners legal fees when they sue the HOA. Then we go to trial. Okay, just wanted to make sure you were prepared for that. As summer wore on, I continued to document everything. I kept detailed records of every interaction with the HOA, every piece of mail, every phone call. I also kept watching other properties in the neighborhood, and what I noticed was interesting. The properties belonging to board members or their friends seemed to get away with violations that would have earned anyone else a fine. Martin Hughes, the board secretary, had grass that was consistently over 4 inches tall. No violation notice. Jennifer Crane had a fence that was clearly faded and in need of repainting according to the guidelines. No violation notice. Deborah Walsh had a rose bush that extended over the sidewalk. No violation notice. I documented all of it, and David added it to our evidence file. In late July, something happened that changed everything. I was leaving for work early one morning when I saw Patricia Morrison's car pull up to the curb in front of my house. She got out, clipboard in hand, and started walking up the sidewalk toward my property. I waited by my car, curious about what violation she was going to dream up this time. Patricia was so focused on her clipboard and scrutinizing my front yard that she did not notice the thin film of morning dew that had made her own shadow on the grass turn into a darker patch. But she definitely noticed when her shoe hit a section of the concrete where a sprinkler's overspray had left it slightly damp and slippery. Her feet went out from under her so fast it would have been comical if she had not hit the ground so hard. The clipboard went flying and Patricia let out a yelp of pain. I ran over immediately. "Patricia, are you okay?" She was lying on her side, clutching her wrist, her face pale. "My arm. I think I broke my arm." I called 911 and within 10 minutes an ambulance arrived. The paramedics carefully loaded Patricia onto a stretcher, stabilizing her arm. As they were putting her in the ambulance, she looked at me with pure hatred in her eyes. "This is your fault," she hissed. "Your sprinklers made the walkway wet." "Patricia, you were walking on my property uninvited at 7 in the morning looking for violations. My sprinklers run at 5 in the morning and it's July. Things get wet." She did not respond, and the ambulance doors closed. I thought that would be the end of it, but I was wrong. A week later, David called me, and he sounded almost amused. "Frank, you're not going to believe this. Patricia Morrison is threatening to sue you for her medical bills. She broke her wrist in 2 places when she fell on your property. She was on my property without permission, looking for ways to find me. That's not my fault." "I know. And actually, this gets better, or worse, depending on your perspective. Brennan was supposed to depose you next week for the HOA lawsuit. Guess who is going to be there representing the HOA? Brennan himself, correct. And guess where he wanted to hold the deposition? I have no idea. At the HOA office. And guess what I discovered when I went to the HOA office yesterday to drop off some documents? Just tell me, David. The front steps of the HOA office are covered in ice. In July. They've got an air conditioning unit that's draining improperly, and the runoff has been freezing on the concrete steps because the steps are in constant shade, and apparently the concrete stays cold enough that the water freezes even in summer. It's a thin layer, but it's definitely ice. I started laughing. I could not help it. "You're kidding." "I am not kidding. I took photos." This is the same HOA that fined you $500 for ice on your walkway in January, and they have ice on their own office steps in July because they cannot be bothered to fix their air conditioning drainage. This is perfect. This is absolutely perfect. It gets better, Frank. Want to guess what happened this morning? Tell me. Marcus Brennan went to the HOA office for a meeting with Patricia Morrison and the board. He was walking up those steps with his briefcase, focused on his phone, and he slipped on the ice. He's in the hospital right now with a concussion and a badly sprained ankle. I sat down hard in my kitchen chair, still laughing. No way. I heard about it from Linda, the receptionist. She called me because she's apparently fed up with the whole situation and thought I should know. She sent me photos of the steps and photos of the incident report the ambulance crew filed. So their own lawyer slipped on their own icy steps while representing them in a lawsuit about me being fined for icy steps. The irony is not lost on anyone involved, trust me. This changed the entire dynamic of the case. David immediately filed an amended complaint adding additional evidence of the HOA's hypocrisy and negligence. The photos of the icy steps at the HOA office became exhibit A in our argument about selective enforcement and unreasonable standards. The local news picked up the story again. The headline this time read, "HOA lawyer slips on ice at HOA office in ongoing ice fine dispute." The article was gleeful in its recounting of the situation, and the comments section was full of people expressing their hatred for HOAs and their support for my case. Patricia Morrison tried to do damage control, issuing a statement through the HOA's website claiming that the ice at the office was a temporary maintenance issue that was completely different from the situation with my walkway. But nobody was buying it. 2 weeks later, Brennan called David with a new settlement offer. This time, they were willing to rescind all fines, pay 50% of my attorney's fees, and issue a formal apology. David told them that was not good enough. We wanted full attorney's fees and a change to the HOA's enforcement policies to prevent this kind of selective enforcement in the future. They refused, and we headed toward trial. The trial was scheduled for late August, and as the date approached, I could feel the tension in the neighborhood. People were taking sides. Some homeowners were openly supporting me, even offering to testify about their own experiences with unfair enforcement. Others, particularly those close to Patricia Morrison, were circling the wagons and defending the board. The day before trial, something unexpected happened. Roger Chen resigned from the HOA board. He sent an email to all homeowners explaining that he could no longer in good conscience support the board's actions, and that he believed the lawsuit had merit. His resignation email was detailed and damning, describing a pattern of selective enforcement and personal vendettas carried out by Patricia Morrison with Jennifer Crane's support. The email went viral in the neighborhood. People were forwarding it, discussing it, arguing about it. By the time trial started the next morning, it felt like half the neighborhood was crowded into the courtroom gallery to watch. The trial itself was fascinating in the way that legal proceedings can be when you are personally invested in the outcome. David presented our case methodically, walking through the evidence of selective enforcement, showing photos of other icy properties that had not been fined, documenting the retaliatory violations I had received after hiring a lawyer. When he brought out the photos of the icy steps at the HOA office and the incident report from Brennan's fall, you could feel the mood in the courtroom shift. Even the judge, a stern woman in her 60s named Judge Carolyn Martinez, raised her eyebrows. Brennan, appearing in court with a visible limp and a walking cane from his injury, tried to argue that the HOA had acted reasonably and within its authority. He claimed that the ice at the office was a different situation, that my walkway had been particularly hazardous, that the other properties I had photographed had been inspected later and addressed. But David was relentless. He brought up the dates of my photos, cross-referenced them with HOA inspection records that we had obtained through discovery, and showed that there was no record of any inspections or violations issued for those other properties. He brought up the subsequent retaliatory fines I had received. He hammered home the point about the icy steps at the office. Then David called Patricia Morrison to the stand. Watching Patricia testify was uncomfortable. She was defensive, evasive, and clearly angry. When David asked her about the inspection schedule and why certain properties were inspected more frequently than others, she claimed it was random. When he showed her evidence that my property had been inspected 11 times in 3 months, while board members' properties had not been inspected at all, she claimed that was coincidental. Mrs. Morrison, isn't it true that you personally conducted the inspection that resulted in the $500 fine against Mr. Keller? Yes. And isn't it true that you were at his property at 7 o'clock in the morning on a Sunday? The inspection time is not relevant to whether a violation occurred, but it is relevant to whether the violation was avoidable, isn't it? Mr. Keller testified that he salted his walkway the night before. The Weather Service data shows that temperatures dropped unexpectedly in the early morning hours. Isn't it true that the ice you observed had formed only hours before your inspection? I don't know when the ice formed. I only know that it was there. And yet the HOA office has had ice on its front steps for over 2 months, according to testimony from the receptionist Linda Chen. Has the HOA fined itself for that violation? That's different. That's a maintenance issue that we're addressing. But Mr. Keller's ice was also a maintenance issue that he was addressing by salting his walkway. Why is one a finnable violation and the other just a maintenance issue? Patricia did not have a good answer for that. The trial lasted 3 days. On the final day, both sides gave their closing arguments. David was passionate and precise, arguing that the HOA had abused its authority, engaged in selective enforcement, and then retaliated against me for daring to challenge them. Brennan argued that HOAs needed broad authority to maintain community standards, and that isolated incidents of alleged unfairness did not constitute a pattern of misconduct. Judge Martinez took a day to consider her ruling. The next afternoon, I sat in the courtroom with David, my leg bouncing nervously, as the judge entered and took her seat. I've reviewed all the evidence and testimony in this case carefully, Judge Martinez began. This court finds that the Riverside Meadows HOA violated Wisconsin statutes regarding fair and consistent enforcement of community rules. The evidence clearly demonstrates that the plaintiff, Mr. Frank Keller, was subjected to selective enforcement and retaliatory action after he challenged the initial fine. I felt David's hand on my shoulder, squeezing. The court finds that the initial $500 fine was unreasonable given the circumstances, and the evidence that Mr. Keller had taken appropriate precautions to maintain his walkway. Furthermore, the court finds that the subsequent violation notices issued to Mr. Keller were retaliatory in nature and constitute harassment. Judge Martinez looked directly at Patricia Morrison, who was sitting at the defense table looking like she had been carved from ice herself. The court is particularly troubled by the evidence regarding the HOA office's own premises. An organization cannot reasonably fine homeowners for conditions that it allows to persist on its own property, particularly when those conditions result in injury to its own legal counsel. That demonstrates either gross hypocrisy or a fundamental lack of understanding of the very rules the HOA purports to enforce. She returned her attention to her notes. Therefore, the court orders the following. First, the Riverside Meadows HOA must rescind all fines issued to Frank Keller and refund any amounts already paid. Second, the HOA must pay Mr. Keller's reasonable attorney's fees to be determined by supplemental briefing. Third, the HOA must revise its enforcement policies to include a clear appeals process, standards for consistent enforcement, and protections against retaliatory action. Fourth, the HOA must conduct a comprehensive safety inspection of its own office and common areas and remedy any violations within 60 days. I could barely breathe. We had won. We had actually won. Additionally, Judge Martinez continued, the court notes that some of the HOA's actions in this case appear to border on harassment, which could potentially constitute a violation of state consumer protection laws. While that issue is not before this court today, I am ordering the court clerk to forward a copy of this ruling to the Wisconsin Department of Agriculture, Trade, and Consumer Protection for their review. That last part made David sit up straighter. A referral to the State Consumer Protection Agency was serious business. If they decided to investigate, the HOA could face significant penalties, beyond just what they owed me. After the judge dismissed court, David and I walked out into the hallway, and he was grinning like a kid on Christmas morning. That was a better outcome than I even hoped for. Not only did we win on all counts, but she's referring them to state regulators. That's huge, Frank. We shook hands, and I felt a weight lift off my shoulders that I had been carrying for 8 months. 8 months of stress, of constant vigilance, of watching my every move and documenting every violation. It was over. The fallout from the trial was swift and dramatic. Within a week, Patricia Morrison resigned as HOA president, issuing a terse one-sentence resignation letter with no explanation. Jennifer Crane also resigned from the board. Deborah Walsh and Martin Hughes remained, but they were now part of a greatly diminished board that had to quickly recruit new members to reach a quorum. The State Consumer Protection Agency did indeed open an investigation into the HOA's practices. They requested records going back 5 years, looking at patterns of fines and enforcement across the entire neighborhood. What they found was damning. It turned out that over the past 2 years since Patricia Morrison had become president, fines had increased by 300%. But those fines were not evenly distributed. Properties owned by people Patricia knew personally or who served on the board averaged 0 fines. Properties owned by people who had ever challenged the board or spoken against Patricia at meetings averaged over $2,000 in fines per year. The investigation revealed what amounted to a shakedown operation. Patricia had been using her position to punish people she did not like and reward people who stayed in line. Some homeowners had been fined so excessively that they had actually sold their homes and moved rather than continue fighting. In November, the state filed civil charges against Patricia Morrison personally and against the HOA as an entity. The charges included violations of the Wisconsin Consumer Protection Act, unlawful harassment, and abuse of authority. The potential penalties included heavy fines and an order to reform the HOA's governance structure completely. Patricia hired a different lawyer this time, not Brennan, who had apparently decided that representing HOAs was not worth the headache after his injury. Her new lawyer negotiated a settlement with the state in which Patricia agreed to pay a $25,000 fine, reimburse dozens of homeowners for excessive fines they had paid, and accept a permanent ban from serving on any HOA board in Wisconsin. The HOA itself was placed under a consent decree requiring state oversight of its enforcement actions for 3 years. Any fine over $100 had to be approved by a state mediator. Any homeowner who felt they were being unfairly targeted could request an immediate review by the state. For me, the final accounting was satisfying. The HOA paid my attorney's fees, which totaled just over $8,000. I received my $500 fine back, plus the costs of the subsequent violation notices they had issued during their harassment campaign. The check came with a formal letter of apology signed by the new board president, a retired teacher named Helen Grayson, who seemed genuinely committed to running the HOA fairly. More importantly, the entire atmosphere in the neighborhood changed. The new board adopted a policy of issuing warnings for first-time violations and giving homeowners reasonable time to remedy issues before imposing fines. They created a real appeals process with an independent mediator. They started holding open forums where homeowners could voice concerns without fear of retaliation. Sarah Turner, my neighbor who had been fined for her beige shutters, filed a claim for reimbursement and got her $200 back, plus the cost of the paint she had bought. Roger Chen, who had resigned from the board in protest, was elected as the new vice president under Helen's leadership. Even Linda, the long-suffering receptionist, got a raise and a better title as the new community manager. As for me, I became something of a minor celebrity in the neighborhood. People would stop me when I was out walking my dog to thank me for standing up to Patricia Morrison. Some called me a hero, though I did not feel like one. I had just been a guy who was angry about an unfair fine and stubborn enough to fight it. The icy steps at the HOA office were finally repaired in October, 7 months after Brennan's fall. They fixed the air conditioning drainage, resurfaced the concrete, and installed non-slip treads. A small plaque was placed near the steps reading "Maintained for Safety," which some residents found darkly funny given the history. Brennan recovered from his injuries, though I heard through the legal community grapevine that he walked with a slight limp now and had become much more cautious about taking on HOA cases. The irony of an HOA lawyer being injured by an HOA's negligence while defending the HOA in a case about safety violations was not lost on anyone. Patricia Morrison disappeared from neighborhood life entirely. I heard she moved to a condo in downtown Milwaukee where there was no HOA. I hoped she had learned something from the experience, but I doubted it. People like Patricia rarely changed their fundamental nature. They just found new venues for their need to control others. The following January, exactly 1 year after the original violation notice, Wisconsin experienced another brutal cold snap with freezing rain. I went out on Sunday morning at 6 o'clock, before the sun came up, and carefully salted my entire walkway. Then I went back inside, made coffee, and watched the sunrise from my kitchen window. No violation notice appeared under my door. No clipboard-wielding HOA president inspected my property at 7 in the morning. The new board had adopted a sensible policy that recognized the reality of Wisconsin winters. Homeowners were expected to maintain their properties with reasonable diligence, but they were not expected to control the weather or prevent every possible ice formation during unpredictable conditions. It seemed like common sense. It seemed like how things should have been all along. That afternoon, I went for a walk around the neighborhood. There were icy patches on some sidewalks, including my own where the salt had not completely melted everything yet. But there were also kids sledding in their yards, neighbors chatting on their porches despite the cold, and a general sense of community that had been missing during Patricia Morrison's reign of petty tyranny. I walked past the community center where the board meetings were held and saw a flyer announcing the next meeting. The agenda included items about playground renovations, a neighborhood garage sale in the spring, and a community garden proposal. Boring, normal HOA business, the way it should be. As I walked home, I thought about the whole experience. 8 months of stress, thousands of dollars in legal fees, even though I eventually got reimbursed. The constant anxiety of wondering what Patricia would target next, the absurdity of going to trial over ice on a sidewalk. But I also thought about what we had accomplished. Dozens of homeowners had been reimbursed for unfair fines. The HOA now operated under actual oversight and had real accountability. Patricia Morrison could not hurt anyone else with her arbitrary enforcement and personal vendettas. Standing up to the HOA had been exhausting and expensive and stressful, but it had also been worth it, not just for me, but for everyone in the neighborhood who had suffered under Patricia's regime and had felt powerless to fight back. Sometimes the system works. Sometimes standing up to bureaucratic bullies makes a difference. Sometimes the irony of an HOA lawyer slipping on the HOA's own icy steps is enough to make a judge see through the hypocrisy and rule in favor of common sense. I smiled as I reached my house, looking at my front walkway with its thin patches of ice already melting in the afternoon sun. My properly salted, reasonably maintained, completely normal suburban sidewalk that had somehow become the center of an 8-month legal battle. Next time it snows, I thought, I will still salt my walkway. Not because I am afraid of Patricia Morrison or another unreasonable fine, but because it is the right thing to do, because I care about safety, because I am a responsible homeowner. But I will do it on my own schedule, with reasonable diligence, knowing that I cannot control the weather and should not be punished for the unpredictable behavior of ice in a Wisconsin winter. And if anyone from the HOA has a problem with that, well, they know where to find me. And more importantly, they know I will fight back. I went inside, hung up my coat, and sat down at my kitchen table. The evening light was streaming through the windows, casting long shadows across the floor. My house, my property, my walkway. Mine to maintain according to reasonable standards, not the arbitrary whims of a power-hungry HOA president with a clipboard and too much time on her hands. The whole experience had taught me something important about homeownership and community living. HOAs exist, in theory, to maintain property values and community standards. But when they are run by petty tyrants who use rules as weapons rather than guidelines for reasonable community behavior, they become toxic institutions that make people's lives miserable. The key is accountability. Oversight. The ability to challenge unfair decisions without fear of retaliation. The new board under Helen Grayson seemed to understand that. They were running the HOA like adults managing a shared community resource, not like dictators ruling over their personal fiefdom. I pulled up my email and saw a message from David Sheffield. Just checking in, the message read, "How are things in the neighborhood these days?" I typed back, quiet. "Boring." Exactly how an HOA should be. His response came back within minutes. "That's the best possible outcome. You did good, Frank. You stood up when a lot of people would have just paid the fine and moved on. You made a difference." I closed my laptop and looked around my kitchen. My home. The place I had fought for, not because of the physical property itself, but because of the principle. Because nobody should be punished for circumstances beyond their control. Because enforcement should be fair and consistent. Because power should not be abused. The ice fine that started this whole mess had been issued on a Sunday morning in January. Now, another January had come and gone, and I was still here. Patricia Morrison was gone. The HOA had been reformed. Justice, in its slow and grinding way, had eventually prevailed. I thought about Brennan, the HOA lawyer who had slipped on those icy steps at the HOA office. The poetic justice of it still made me shake my head in amazement. He had been there to defend the HOA's position that I should have been fined for ice on my walkway, and he had literally fallen victim to the same hazard on the HOA's own property. You could not make that up. If I had written it as fiction, people would have said it was too convenient, too on the nose. But reality does not care about narrative subtlety. Sometimes the universe delivers irony with a sledgehammer instead of a scalpel. The last I heard, Brennan had recovered physically, but had started limiting his practice to less contentious areas of law. Apparently getting a concussion while representing an HOA had given him a new perspective on whether those clients were worth the trouble. As spring approached, the neighborhood continued to settle into its new normal. The state oversight of the HOA's enforcement actions proved to be exactly what was needed. The mediator rejected several proposed fines that were clearly excessive or based on overly technical interpretations of the guidelines. The board learned quickly that they could not get away with the kind of behavior Patricia had engaged in. Property values in the neighborhood actually increased. Turns out that when people feel like they are living in a reasonable community rather than under the thumb of a petty tyrant, they are more likely to invest in their homes and recommend the neighborhood to others. Several houses sold quickly that spring, with real estate agents specifically mentioning the HOA reforms as a selling point. Helen Grayson turned out to be exactly the kind of president the HOA needed. She was fair, transparent, and focused on actual community improvement rather than nitpicking violations. Under her leadership, the board tackled real issues like improving the neighborhood playground, organizing community events, and negotiating better rates for snow removal services. The irony was not lost on anyone that the neighborhood was now better maintained and more pleasant to live in without the aggressive enforcement tactics Patricia had employed. Turns out that treating homeowners like adults and giving them reasonable guidance worked better than treating them like children who needed constant supervision and punishment. I stayed involved in HOA meetings, attending regularly to make sure the reform stuck. Other homeowners who had been burned by Patricia's regime did the same. We formed an unofficial watchdog group, not to cause trouble, but to ensure transparency and accountability. Roger Chen, now serving as vice president, told me one evening after a meeting, "You know, Frank, I think what happened with your case was a turning point for this entire neighborhood. It exposed how toxic things had become and gave us an opportunity to fix it. I am glad you did not just pay the fine and move on." "I am glad too," I said, though there were moments during the lawsuit when I wondered if I was crazy for fighting over $500. "It was never about the money," Roger said. "It was about the principle, and you were right to fight." As summer arrived and the weather warmed, I found myself appreciating my home and neighborhood in ways I had not before the whole ice fine incident. Maybe it was because I had fought for it. Maybe it was because the community had come together to reform the HOA. Maybe it was just relief that the stress and uncertainty were finally over. Whatever the reason, I felt more rooted in Riverside Meadows than I ever had before. This was not just a place I lived. It was my community, one that I had helped improve by refusing to accept injustice. The final chapter of the story came in August, when the state completed its oversight review and issued its report. The report praised the HOA's reforms and noted that complaint rates had dropped by 92% since the new board took over. Property maintenance compliance had actually improved despite the reduction in fines, suggesting that the punitive approach had been counterproductive all along. The state decided to end its formal oversight early, concluding that the HOA had successfully reformed its practices and no longer posed a risk to homeowners. The consent decree was terminated, though the state made clear that any future complaints would be taken seriously given the history. I received a copy of the report in the mail, along with a letter from the State Consumer Protection Agency, thanking me for bringing the issues to their attention. "Your willingness to stand up for your rights," the letter read, "helped us identify and correct a pattern of abuse that was affecting dozens of homeowners. Your actions made a real difference." I put the letter in a folder with all the other documents from the case. The violation notices, the legal filings, the trial transcripts, the settlement agreements. A complete record of 8 months that had started with a $500 fine for ice on my walkway and ended with comprehensive HOA reform and state oversight. It was a thick folder. A lot of paper for what should have been a simple matter of weather and winter maintenance in Wisconsin. But it told an important story about standing up for principle, about holding institutions accountable, and about the power of regular citizens to challenge unfair authority when necessary. And somewhere in that folder was a photo, taken by David's paralegal, of those icy steps at the HOA office. The steps where Marcus Brennan had fallen while representing the HOA in their defense against my ice fine lawsuit. The universe had delivered justice with a sense of humor. The HOA that fined me for ice on my walkway had ice on their own steps. The lawyer arguing that I should have prevented every possible ice formation had slipped on ice at his client's property. Perfect irony. Perfect justice. I closed the folder and put it away on my bookshelf. The story was over. The HOA was reformed. The neighborhood was thriving. Life had returned to normal, and when winter came around again, I would salt my walkway with reasonable diligence, secure in the knowledge that I would not be punished for the unpredictable behavior of Wisconsin weather. Because that is how it should be. That is how it always should have been. And if Patricia Morrison was somewhere out there in her condo in downtown Milwaukee, I hoped she had learned something from the experience. Though somehow I doubted it, people like Patricia rarely changed. They just found new targets for their need to control. But at least in Riverside Meadows, her reign of petty tyranny was over. The neighborhood had survived her and emerged stronger and more united because of it. And I had learned that sometimes the most important battles are the ones that seem small and petty on the surface. Because those battles are often about something much larger: dignity, fairness, and the right to be treated reasonably by the institutions that govern our daily lives. $500 for ice on a walkway in January in Wisconsin. It seemed absurd when I first got that violation notice. It still seemed absurd now, but fighting that absurdity had been one of the most important things I had ever done, not because of the money. Not even because of the principle, really, but because someone needed to stand up and say, "This is not okay. This is not how we treat each other in a community. This is not acceptable." And sometimes, just sometimes, saying that out loud and refusing to back down is enough to change things. The ice melted, spring came, and life went on in Riverside Meadows, but the neighborhood was different now. Better, fairer, more just, and I had played a part in making that happen. That was worth more than any $500 fine, any $8,000 in legal fees, any amount of stress and anxiety during those 8 months of fighting. It was worth it because we had proven that the system could work. That accountability mattered. That standing up to bullies made a difference. And because Marcus Brennan had slipped on the HOA's own icy steps, delivering a moment of poetic justice so perfect that it would make me smile every time I thought about it for years to come, justice had been served. The HOA had been reformed. The neighborhood had been saved from petty tyranny. And my walkway, properly salted and reasonably maintained, remained ice-free through another Wisconsin winter. Mission accomplished.